If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open to Daniel chapter 8. Daniel 8, and I'm going to start with reading the chapter for us this morning. Let's listen now with faith to God's holy word. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offerings, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." And so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end." And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. He said, "Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that he has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. And then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. This is God's word. Amen. Well, we could just jump to the end and say, with Daniel, we're appalled and we don't understand it. But that, I think we can do better than that. And because after all, God was merciful to give to Daniel some built-in interpretation there. So 2 weeks ago, we completed the broad sweep of world history that was seen in Daniel 7. Remember, we had the 4 beasts coming out of the sea. You had a lion, a bear, a leopard, a 4-headed leopard at that, and a monster. Each one represented an evil empire, an evil world kind of dominating empire. The lion is Babylonia. It would be replaced by the bear, Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia, in turn, will be replaced by the leopard, the kingdom of Greece. And Greece finally will be replaced by the monster, the Roman Empire. And we even see from its wreckage, a little horn is going to rise who will attack and persecute God's people. But remember, that little horn is coming out of some broken version of the Roman Empire down line. Yet the Ancient of Days, our righteous judge, will indeed judge, destroying this little horn with fire. He will give his everlasting kingdom to his people. And Daniel 7 tells us that God gave Daniel this 50,000-foot view of human history from the time of Babylon to the destruction of the end-time Antichrist and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. I mean, we're not quite to that end yet. So I don't know how many thousands of years, but we're going on, 2,500 years at least at this point from the beginning of the Babylon vision, and then some. In contrast, and Daniel 8 is a contrast, even though there are these elements that seem to overlap, and they do, but it's a contrast because Daniel 8 takes this zoom lens look at the second and third kingdoms, at Medo-Persia and Greece, with only a time window of roughly 200 years, 2,500 years and counting versus a defined narrow window of a couple hundred years. A couple hundred years for most world empires is a relatively tight window of time. So America is going to be celebrating our 250th next year. How many of you remember when we celebrated our 200th? I thought the bicentennial was a big deal. I said, what are you going to call the 250th? This is less than the length of the age of our country. Roughly a time window between 350 BC and 164 BC. Moreover, in chapter 8, the angel specifically identifies the ram as the Medo-Persian kingdom and the goat as the Greek kingdom. We have specific identities there. We're not. Chapter 7 left us to make a go at it based on the succession of kingdoms that we would see in Daniel 2 in the vision of the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had. We see these different beasts representing different things here. Here, we have very specific, the angel gives us that interpretation. And so although this information simplifies the interpretation of this chapter, we still have other images here that need to be identified. We need to identify what this little horn is, verse 9, or who the host of heaven is in verse 10, or probably the simplest one in many ways, the prince of hosts, the prince of princes in verse 11. And we even need to wrestle a little bit with what 2,300 evenings and mornings is about. But probably most challenging for us is we're still going to have to consider what relevance is this for us today. What relevance is a prophecy that was apparently fulfilled long ago, that was about this little narrow window of time, 150 years before Christ was even born. Especially since the little horn seems to be, in all honesty, simply a small footnote in most tellings of human history. You have to find a particular history of the ancient Near East to find anything more about Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, we'll see is the little horn. He's just a regional neighborhood thug, but he's the dominant thing in this passage. The chapter outline is really simple. We have the setting in verses 1 and 2, Daniel telling us when he had this vision and the circumstances of what he saw. the vision itself proper in verse 3 to 14, but then we also have the interpretation of the vision by Gabriel in verses 15 to 26. And then we have verse 27. We have Daniel's response to the vision, his unsettledness. Dale Ralph Davis observes concerning this chapter, he says, but the question remains, why all the fuss over a relatively obscure king? The implied response Daniel 8 gives is that it's important for God's people to know and prepare for what they will have to face. Not only near the end, as we would see in chapter 7, near the end as in the end of all human history, but also all the things we would face along the way. Antiochus Epiphanes was, for Israel, a pretty heavy burden to bear, but he was someone that they ran into along the way. I appreciated Davis's approach to this, so I'm going to have in my sermon approach similarly this, which basically, since we have this clarity of the vision and the vision interpreted by and large, I think we can actually focus and just draw on the second half to make observations as we go. But the first is this. He makes these two main points, that in verses 1 to 8, and also in verses 20 to 23 in the interpretation part, we see that God steadies his people to walk through the course of human history. In the way in which the world is so unsettled, you can imagine it's easy to trip and stumble. It's a difficult place. So he steadies his people. He gives us good ground to walk on. So not only does he steady his people, but then also the second point is this, that God forearms his people to face the crises of history, verses 9 to 19. He equips us to be ready to respond when this crisis comes close to home. So verses 1 to 8, God steadies us. Verses 9 to 19, God forearms us. He equips us to respond. So Daniel's vision comes about the year 550 BC. That would be the third year of Belshazzar's reign. It's kind of interesting. We first see Belshazzar back in chapter 5, and we see him at, the last day of his reign. Yeah. We see him at the very end. That's it. He decides to go out on a high note, or actually a low note, offends God, and God removes him and puts in Darius that very night. But Daniel 7 was the first year of Belshazzar's reign. This chapter is the third year of Belshazzar's reign. We got a sense from chapter 5, by the way, that Daniel during Belshazzar's reign had been relegated to, he was back in the stock room or somewhere in the mail room. He got demoted, and he wasn't quite up on the front line like he had been with Nebuchadnezzar, and like he would be restored with King Darius. Belshazzar sort of knew who he was, but he wasn't up close in his work. And so we have this vision coming, this third year of Belshazzar, and Daniel sees himself in Susa, the citadel, the capital actually, that was near the river, the canal, Ulai, which is about 220 miles from Babylon. I think for the sake of understanding the vision, I think Daniel is in Susa in the vision, not in actuality. So my guess is he's still ministering, serving in whatever government capacity in Babylon, but this vision takes him to Susa. And what's interesting about that is, for Jews who are reading this later, they would immediately recognize that Susa is the capital of Persia. This time it's within Babylon, or Babylonia. It's still within that domain. It's in this province of Elam, which, by the way, no one really would have cared about during the time of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC. But during this time is a very particular time where Elam was a province of Babylonia, but eventually would become the dominant region of Persia. So what we have in his vision, Daniel has moved from the kingdom of Babylonia to the next great empire, in a sense, to Medo Persia. Right off the bat, Daniel should be sensing something's going on in here that's not quite Babylonia focused, not quite Belshazzar focused. This is after the fact. Let me make one other point as we go forward here. I want to remind you that, remember, Daniel is broken into parts written in Hebrew and parts written in Aramaic. Hebrew starts off in chapter 1 and goes all the way through the first 3 or so verses of chapter 2. From that point, all the way through the end of chapter 7, Daniel's written in Aramaic, the language of Babylon. Last time when we were in Daniel 7 was still written in Aramaic. In a sense, it's the language of the global work of God. In the world at large, the vision given to Nebuchadnezzar of successive kingdoms and things like that, of God's rule over all of the world, all of human history. But now we switch back to Hebrew. In a sense, I think this may be a bit of a cue for us, a signal that we're switching into a mode which is most importantly focused on Israel as God's people, the host of heaven as related to the prince of the host, as it were, God's people under God's reign. And so the Aramaic portion of Daniel, which ran through the middle of 2 through to chapter 7, Gentile. Now we're back to the vision dealing with what's going to touch on Israel. Very helpful for us is that the angel Gabriel here gives to Daniel and gives to us a simple gloss of these strange animal games that Daniel saw. The first is simply this: the ram signifies the kings of Media and Persia, one animal, two different horns, the second one being bigger, that'd be Persia. Persia really was the more dominant of those two empires when they merged. And so, apparently what Daniel sees is the horns came up in sequence, both big, but the second one bigger than others. And what do we see? The ram is simply conquering. He's unconquerable. Verse 4, he does what he wants. He's just kind of running around like a wild animal. That is, at least until the goat plows into the Persian ram, smashing and stomping it. Verses 5 to 7. And Gabriel again tells us that the goat is Greece, there in verse 21. And the goat operates in lightning style. That is, he's flying so fast, his feet even aren't touching the ground. That corresponds with that singular horn of Greece, Alexander the Great, that lightning speed that conquered the known world. This huge horn in verse 5 symbolizes the first king of the goat empire and proves to be Alexander the Great. But he exits quickly. He's broken. That is, he dies in 323 BC, barely 10 years of doing King Alexander stuff. He'd already conquered the world. His life was, he was a bored 30-year-old. Nothing else to conquer. He gets just a couple verses. One of the things that this passage doesn't quite pick up on, though we saw it in some of the earlier passages, how different empires kind of have residual impact going forward in history. One of the absolutely enduring aspects of Alexander was the Hellenizing, the making Greek the common language throughout the known world. Everywhere was Greek speaking predominantly, or at least if you wanted to get along with how the world operated, you would know Greek. You would learn Greek philosophers. You would emulate Greek rhetoric. Everything was about being Greek. And that's true of these four horns. I think we often forget that this aspect of Hellenizing endured all the way through. Think about the ministry of Christ in the first century. Greek is still the dominant cultural glue. Even though Rome is dominating, it's Greek that's the trade language. It's Greek that is the principal source for learning, even if the Romans want to steal it and make it more Latin sounding. It still is coming from Greece. But Alexander, this incredible flash in history and gone, broken, his empire gets parceled out to four other horns there in verse 8. We're told that in verse 22, that's the interpretation. And after an unsettled window of time, almost 20 years, four of Alexander's generals kind of finally come up with a settled peace. Cassander over Macedonia and Greece, Lysimachus over Thrace and Asia Minor, Seleucus over Syria and Mesopotamia, and then Ptolemy in Egypt. It's pretty funny. I mean, my point about being Alexander's Hellenizing of the world is these four kingdoms were Greek kingdoms. The Ptolemies in Egypt were Greek. Cleopatra She may have styled herself like a pharaoh queen, but the reality is she was Greek. She's hanging out with Roman folks, think Mark Antony and all that kind of stuff. In the same way, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Mesopotamia, it's still Greek. So these little Greek fiefdoms are the result. A couple observations here. Notice that Daniel's vision that depicts an incredibly turbulent, uh, extended time of history here. In these 200 years, in this brevity of time, we've got things that are coming into existence and fading away. You have 200 years of history and political puffery are in one verse. Most of it's right there. It's summed up in that little verse. The dominant work of Antiochus gets most of the press, and it's only over a relatively narrow window of time of 4.5, 5, 6, 7 years in that window. Of course, Daniel didn't know any of the particular timeline of this chronology, or he couldn't tell how much was scrunched up into that vision. But he certainly realized that in one empire battering another into oblivion, and that empire itself turning into disintegrated chunks of its former glory and greatness, it meant he was looking at a span of years. And so the reality is this part of history is anything but peaceful and calm. He's watching it from the other side of the riverbank, but this is kind of an unsettling thing to see happening here. He's understanding now as Gabriel's unpacking it that he's looking at kingdoms, empires coming and going, conquest, upheaval, and demise, the end of these things. Nations are at the same time incredibly powerful and furious in their wrath against one another, and fragile. They're actually not durable kingdoms. And the reality is, this is where the people of God have to live. This history, in a sense, is their street address. It's unsettling. And so we have here in Daniel's vision this instructive and humbling history. Verse 4 starts off in this rather auspicious way that gives us the impression that the Persian ram is he's unbeatable. If you know your ancient history, the Persians, think King Xerxes and his 1 million man immortals, unbeatable. Wherever they went, they conquered. They gave Greece a hard time for a long time, at least until they didn't, until they were conquered. And so we're shocked when we see this king of the hill activity simply become the stompings under the feet of a goat, just like that. I mean, it happens in an instant. What's interesting is that doesn't happen to the goat kingdom, at least not in that same way. It's just that the great horns, they're mortal. They are just men. No one conquered Alexander the Great except death, and a young death at that. So a ruler can die and everything falls apart. That's what happened to Alexander's empire. He dies, and instantly what he did to hold it all together, it starts falling apart. In that sense, as one commentator observed, the text is implying that just because they're superpowers, it doesn't mean they're actually safe places. Power can be overthrown like that. A power can be overthrown from the outside by conquest. A powerful person can go like that through death, and the legacy is simply a small fracturing of what the residue of power and empire. These empires can get knocked off, they can peter out, they come and go. These great states, these great empires are tenuous. That is, they look good today, but it doesn't take long to turn the tide. So America's going to celebrate our 250th anniversary. Is it the right one? Sesquicentennial, is that the right one? Sound good? 250 is easier. We're probably going to go 250 more, right? history doesn't have many 500-year-long empires. Even today, we have countries with names that reflect long heritage, but the sun never setting on the British Empire is now, they're back down to 1.5 islands, right? And even then, they can't hold on to all of it. Portugal, which had one of the largest dominant presences in the New World. They've got a cute little country there, but that's what they are. We must not let our arrogance presume that we are somehow the exception. I'll give you a little bit of a history lesson. It may be a little gruesome for some of you, but bear with me, it matters. Following World War II, the Nuremberg trials dealt with the war criminals who remained of the Nazi Empire, the Third Reich. Hitler had killed himself at the very last days of the war, so he wasn't one of the ones on trial. But in October they were found guilty in 1946, the execution of these Nazi war criminals on the 16th of October. I think these are the big names, Hermann Goering and General Ribbentrop, those guys. They were executed, their bodies cremated, and they were simply put into a little jar, all of them together, driven a couple hours outside of town, outside of Munich into the Bavarian countryside. Vehicle stopped, poured their ditches into a muddy ravine, rain gully on the side of the road. The rain that night washed it away. That's who they are. A year before, these were evil, wicked, powerful men, but they were powerful. They were the movers and shakers that were shaping World War II in Europe. They were the ones who had made such harm. These men could dominate, they could intimidate. And yet, on that night in 1946, a little drizzle washes them away. That's who we are in history. We can think that we are going to endure, but we're not. This sort of history then, I think, calls us for a sober, for a lasting approach to our discipleship, for following Christ to the end, to know that meaning is found in following the Savior. So here is Daniel in Babylon, aware that the 70 years of exile, of Israel's exile, are coming to a close. We'll read that in those first couple verses of chapter 9. He's reading Jeremiah, and he realizes 70 years is almost up. He hears, perhaps, even in this vision of Persian and Greek empires and those later split-offs that come, maybe even hear and recognizes, wait, that's a story of us being back home in the promised land. Even in the way in which it may seem hard where they are now as exiles, there will be a time coming where they'll be restored back home, but the troubles still will go on because the troubles are always there for God's people. It becomes clear that when the years of exiles end and Israel's back in the glorious land, the beautiful land, they still have to slog through a long stretch of this troubled stuff that we call history. Getting back to the land doesn't mean that the kingdom of God will immediately appear. So often we are tempted to think that we can somehow do things that will make the kingdom of God on earth just be all that we know. The monastic movement in the Middle Ages often would think, well, let's just retreat to our little cloister. We'll have a regulated spiritual life. Even there's still trouble that comes to them. Why? Basic lesson of sin. Sin is portable. And each of us has it. So it goes wherever we go. And if we bring trouble with us wherever we go, the trouble around us out in the world is also always there. So during this time, Israel was to live out their faith in a Gentile-dominated world under circumstances that were going to make it more and more difficult as the years go by to do so. Think about when Christ comes in the first century. The domination of Rome, oppressive and hard. Uh, Rome is assigned Herod to be one of his regional governors, and Herod, styling himself as a king, he's a little tyrant and he wants to go out and, oh, let's just kill all the babies under 2 years of age. Even so, God's control of world empires as they come, as they go, ought to sustain us who are in him. We need to remember all the time that whatever the world looks like around us, God is sovereign. God's agenda is never in jeopardy. Even so, it's good that we know ahead of time. I mean, the reality is, Christ's people today, the church, we're not particularly thrilled to know that we have to keep enduring through troubled times. We really do wish it would be done and over. When I think of our particular context here in the 21st century, I think we have had so many years in our country of some aspect of the Christian life having a culture shaping, a kind of a dominant presence that at least it didn't appear that there was an overt opposition to us. I would suggest that that's a bit of a Pollyannish understanding of history, but nevertheless, we are not now seeing the remaining residue of Christian values in our society. We are starting to feel the alienation increasingly. God is not, his arm is not too short to help us, and we need to continue looking to him. Didn't Jesus tell us that we're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars? We're going to see that nations will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Even so, these aren't the signs. That's not the sign of the end. They're simply the way things are going to be in the present age. Jesus is saying, when you're seeing these things that are so unsettling, every time you see one of these things, you need to be reminded we're one step closer to the Lord Christ coming home, coming or bringing us home, coming back for us. But we're not actually threatened by those things. And so it's in and through these bumpy patches of history that we are to prove faithful in living out our life before God. So God steadies us by giving us information, by this prophetic word. But also God, as I said, forearms us to face the specific challenges of history. So it's not simply that you're watching history go by you or around you in a generic sense, not touching you specifically other than making the society you live in to be hard and unpleasant. But there will be times when the crises come pointing at us, where the arrows and barbs are focused on us. And so jumping back into Daniel's vision, he dealt with the first part of the ram and the goat and Medo-Persia and Greece, and now we're down to this little horn thing. And this singular little horn is trouble. Using the horn imagery, he seems to be a king who's going to come from small or obscure beginnings. And to be honest, the word great is used one time concerning the ram, one time concerning the goat Greece, multiple times, 4 times of this little horn. Much of it basically self-styled greatness at that. And so whether we translated that this little horn, he was or became great, or he made himself great, the reality is this word great just sounds really arrogant. Hey kids, when's the last time you just went to your parents and said, Mom, Dad, I deserve a raise because I'm pretty great? Have any of you tried that? Maybe you can try that tomorrow morning when you get ready to go to school to say, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm pretty great. When Antiochus talks about how great he is, here's what he means. In his arrogance, he opposes God, the Prince of the host. He seeks to eliminate the worship of God, the service of God in the temple, the latter part of verse 11 and 12. He crushes God's people, verses 10 and the beginning of 12. The reality is, Israel is going to get beat up by this little horn. Israel's not going to get beat up by the ram or beat up by the goat. It's kind of interesting. I mean, there's a way in which we can also, in our own pride, presume that only the great enemies we're worthy of big enemies, right? I remember one time in high school, I was one of my college age friends who was discipling some of the younger guys. We were talking, and there was a particular time when he wanted to share that he felt he was being especially targeted by the devil, by Satan himself, in a particular trial, temptation, and difficulty. And me being my gift of bluntness from the Holy Spirit, I believe, emerged early. I was a ninth grader, I think. And I simply said, what makes you so important that the devil would actually pay attention to you? I mean, doesn't he have minions who could take care of that? My friend didn't like that very much, but the reality is the little horn, for all of his bluster, he's a nobody in some ways. There's just not much to him. And yet, here it is, the horn, as is dealing with Israel, is going to do all these things. He's going to the horn will throw truth to the ground. The very word of God, throwing it on the ground in disrespect. He shall be able to succeed in the things he's doing. He's going to desecrate the temple. We're left with the question, why do tyrants get to walk all over God's people sometimes? I mean, the reality is, you don't have to be an empire leading emperor to be a tyrant. Sometimes the most severe tyrants we face are the tyrants at work, maybe even tyrants in our family. I was going to pick on librarians, but I know we have some folks sitting for library. But whatever domain you have, you can face a tyrant there. Antiochus is like that. But what do we have here? We see the angel, the voice of the angel is the one who asks, how long? Interesting, the Psalter is full of those questions where the psalmist will say, Lord, how long? How long? How long will we suffer? How long do we have to wait for you to work? How long until our enemies are given justice? And here an angel is asking, how long? How long are we going to see this little horn's transgression? How long is the worship of God going to be interrupted? How long are God's people going to be harried and harassed and stomped on? And the answer comes this: for 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then the sanctuary will be put right, verse 14. The temptation here, again, for those of us who are coming out of more prophecy-focused kind of backgrounds, are going to think, well, we have to count 2,300 days and figure out where it fits exactly and what's the first day. And I think we need to be careful about that. We need to be careful that we don't become kind of fixated on this idea that you miss the important part. How long is the cry of desperation that one hears from the Lord's servants? It's not a cry of saying, can you tell me the exact number of days? The question wasn't to God, can you start the clock and tell me how much longer we have to go? This isn't the kids in the back seat. How long till we get there? The answer is a tricky one. I land on the side of saying the 2,300 evenings and mornings are meant to be reckoned as days. There's some who make a case, plausible case, but I don't think it's as strong. That the evening and morning differentiation is speaking about sacrifices. So one morning and one evening sacrifice would be two of those things. So it's only half that time, 1,150 days. But you know what? Neither one gives you a nice tight window that fits into the career of Antiochus Epiphanes. 1,150 days is 3 years and change. It's not even the 3.5 years. The 2,300 full days is still less than 7. It's like 6 years and 2 months. It still does not, it doesn't, we think, oh, it's got to be those 7 years of Daniel. No, it's not that. I think it gives us something else. I think the as we've seen so often in Daniel in this apocalyptic material, I think it's meant to be symbolic, and it's pointing to that it's measured in days, not measured in eternity. This is, again, another reminder that God is measuring his work in terms of eternity. The days are limited. They may be long, they may be difficult days, but these, I'm sorry, it says 2 months, 6 years and 4 months. Um, it just simply describes how long is Antiochus's wicked, evil temper tantrum. Long enough to be problematic, but limited. It's a limited one. In verse 15, we see something about the end, until the end. I don't think this end is pointing to the end of history, but it's pointing to the end of this particular trial for Israel. Daniel was given insight of all these visions and all that. He was having trouble understanding this, and it was unsettling to him. It concerned him. We can read Daniel 8 while we're sitting in the pews, and it just kind of passes us overhead. But Daniel is devastated over hearing this. It's so unsettling. He's an older man at this point too. How do we can't even understand what it personally cost him in that sense. What's the end? I think it refers to the how long question. How long until all of it's wrapped up? And this is that we need to look until God is done bringing about the punishment on this Antiochus. Before we go, I do want to wrap up here and let you know a little bit more about Antiochus. I've been making the assertion that this is who it is, but I want you to hear about how bad Antiochus really was. Antiochus Epiphanes, the name Epiphanes means revealed by God or made such by God. He certainly claimed a grand title. So better than Antiochus the Great is Antiochus, the divinely ordained one. And the divinely ordained one, or the divinity that he's appealing to, is Zeus. So, took a while. Antiochus came on the scene roughly in 187 BC. That was or 175 BC. Rather, the Rome had already showed up at this point. You had this interaction between Antiochus III, who wasn't really his father, and Rome, who said, "Stop it." And what do we know about Antiochus? Kindly put, he was a bit quirky. He could move between being very kind and friendly in one moment to absolutely being a terror in the next. I think we need to be careful to speculate, but he was not mentally stable. He wanted to describe himself as this God-manifested being, but there was a joke as well that instead of Epiphanes, he was called Epimenides, which actually meant madman. So how you like that behind your back to say, oh, it's Antiochus the madman. What did he do in his madness? He was reasonably competent. He was reasonably effective as a soldier, but he was always broke. He was always strapped for cash. And because he's always fighting wars, and also because he had to pay a bunch of tribute to Rome, he was running out of money. That is, like any slick politician, Antiochus never met a substantial contributor that he didn't like. You got money? Hey, let's be friends. And so his need to be a perennial fundraiser partly explains his behavior toward Jerusalem in 169 BC. Antiochus had invaded Egypt again. I may have explained previously, but remember, the Seleucid Empire is up to the north, to the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt down to the south, and in between, the beautiful land, Israel. Coming and going. Israel was always seeing one or the other of these infighting groups coming through them. And so this particular time, Antiochus invaded Egypt in his madness, anger, because he got stopped. He was coming back through Jerusalem. One of his lackeys, Menelaus, who was actually the highest bidder for the priesthood. So that's the other thing. Israel's dealing with sellouts. Menelaus gives over a bunch of temple treasure, furniture. Antiochus takes that away, including a bunch of money. So that's kind of what he was doing. And while in Egypt, there's another part. Jason, who was a previous high priest who was ousted, and the rival of the current one, he attacked Jerusalem, and Antiochus saw this as a revolt. And so, in passing through in 169 BC, he not only looted the temple, but he carried out a horrific bloodbath. 40,000 Jews were executed, 40,000 sold off into slavery. He just went crazy. But worse was on the way. The next year, Antiochus invaded Egypt again. This time his success was frustrated by the appearance of a Roman general who told Antiochus he could either finish his Egyptian conquest if he also wanted to fight Rome, which is a bad idea. Otherwise, he should go home. And he had to make his mind right then. He knew what the odds were on that, so he decided to go home. And of course, as he goes home, he has to go through the Holy Land. So he's particularly mad against Jerusalem. So he sends in 167 BC his chief tax collector. He needs money. He sends him to Jerusalem. And the pillage and the massacre and the ruin continues. And that was the order of the day. Antiochus insisted on a forced paganization, as one scholar called it. I don't think it's a real word, but it should be. A forced paganization program that was meant to corrupt and to decimate, to destroy every aspect of Israel's faith and practice. He sought to stamp out the active practice of worshiping God. Listen to how this is described here. The abolition, the end of the temple service, and the observation of the law were forbidden. The substitution of pagan cults were brought in. The observance of all Jewish ordinances, in particular those relating to the Sabbath and circumcision, was prohibited on pain of death. In every town in Judea, sacrifice was to be offered to the heathen gods. Overseers were sent everywhere to see that the royal command was carried out. Where the people did not comply willingly, they were obliged to do so by force. Once a month, a check was made, and whoever was found with a scroll of the Torah or had a child circumcised, they were put to death, and the child with them. Saints, none of us in our generation here faced that kind of persecution where we're having to choose faithfulness to God and loss of life. That we have brothers and sisters in this world for whom that's a daily reality. In the middle of December of 167 BC, in the 15th of the month of Kislev, a heathen altar was built in Jerusalem on the great altar of burnt offering. And on the 25th of Kislev, the first heathen sacrifice was offered on it. It said that Antiochus slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. It was an offering to Zeus, the Great. He sought to totally end the Jewish faith. That's a little taste of Antichrist ahead of time. We'll read about that more in later. But this Antichrist, this antagonism toward God's people is there. So we come back to this idea of why is it necessary to talk about all of this when Antiochus really is a minor history in terms of all of human history? And perhaps there's a better way of understanding is that he wasn't so minor. He is minor in terms of geopolitical things. He was just someone who passed through time in that sense. But when it comes to God's people, they had never faced what they met under Antiochus. They never faced actually a systematic program that was designed to eradicate completely every trace of Israel's faith and worship and life. Even when the northern kingdom was hauled off by Assyria, even when Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon, they were able to preserve aspects of their faith. Daniel was continuing to pray faithfully. He wasn't alone in that, but they could keep their worship. And they were returned to the land, able to worship. Antiochus sought to undo everything. And that's why this in a sense, extreme emergency required the specific prediction that the Lord gave. It would come when Israel, the time when Israel would need this revelation from God. That's the assumption in verse 26. Daniel is to close up the vision, to keep it and to preserve it, because it's going to have relevance, not today or not tomorrow, but many days down timeline. Not in 550 BC, but in 170 BC. Isn't that kind of the Lord to prepare his people for the extreme trouble that they're going to have to endure? But we also see that for us today, that down line from this, we see that in Antiochus, we have a type of picture of what believers will face in an ongoing way in the world as those who are opposed to Christ, as antichrists, little antichrists of all kinds. Knowing ahead is actually being prepared. Let me give you a simple example of this principle. One of my kids and I had a bedtime routine around brushing teeth. They'd run upstairs ahead of me. They'd jump out of the bathroom, usually from behind the door, and they'd yell, "Boo!" And I was supposed to feign surprise. Well, actually, the first time they did it, I actually was surprised, and. But from then on, I'd pretend to be surprised, and she would say something almost always like this: "Are you flabbergasted?" I was like, "Oh, I'm flabbergasted." I don't know why she loved that word, but she did. But the truth is, the fact that I knew what was coming, it made all the difference. I knew it was coming, so I wasn't ever frightened. I wasn't scared. I was able to, respond in the way that I wanted to, which was pretend to be scared, but I wasn't. And she knew I wasn't. It was something we did as part of our fun time as father and daughter. The little horn revelation for us ought to settle and strengthen Israel for the many days when those come. Calvin notes that if nothing had been predicted, even the godly would have glided gently downwards to despair in consequence of their heavy afflictions. If God hadn't told them, you could imagine Israel saying, "Wait, this is what we got returned to the land for? This is all the hopes of, we're singing about Zion. We sang about Zion this morning in this altar. Our hope of being in glory. And we're facing Antiochus. Instead, by telling us God strengthens us for the time. And Jesus gives us the very same kindnesses. Look at John 16, verses 1-4. Jesus says about the things that he's spoken of back in chapter 15 about the trials. He says, "These things I spoke to you in order that you may not fall away." He tells us ahead of time so we won't fall away. We won't give up. We're going to face all sorts of challenges. He says they're going to be kicked out of the synagogues and removed from places of worship. Even the religious bigots are going to be convinced that they're doing it to somehow show their devotion to God, even while executing God's people. And so Jesus says, "But these things I've spoken to you in order that when their hour comes, you might remember them, that I told you about them." Jesus hides nothing in the fine print. He doesn't keep stuff from us. He buries nothing in the little footnotes. In the footnote of human history, Antiochus is nothing. In the story of God preparing us for a time of persecution by a tyrant, he gives Antiochus big play. And so we should pay attention. Christ has been faithful in his candor, his openness with us. He's forewarned us, and in so doing, he also arms us to look to him, to trust him. And even this is a demonstration of his love for us. Why did Israel need to know about this little tin pot despot? Because God was wanting to give to them, like Christ gave to us. "I say these things to you to keep you from falling away." So let's press on and look to Christ.